So do the next topic, which is election funding. Rivari culture we'll do tomorrow. So start with, because it's, we'll do the Red Sea crisis and election funding today. Because if we do Red Sea crisis and Rivari culture, it won't be done in one class. So these two topics can be done in one class together. Tomorrow we'll do then Rivari culture. So write down election funding. Election funding. Now the reason it's in the news is for the electoral bonds, because the Supreme Court said it was invalid and they uphold the public's right to know over the right to privacy of the donors. They ended up saying right to know is under which article? Right to know is under which article? Yeah. Article 19, Clause A, freedom of speech and expression. So the people have the right to know. And right to privacy? 21. And the Supreme Court ended up saying that the right to know in this case would supersede the right to privacy of the donors. So electoral bond would not be asked. That is not in the syllabus. The question in PSIR or GS would be on funding of elections. So there are two concepts in this. One is state funding of elections, and the other is just the theoretical part of campaign financing. So we won't do it from a GS perspective. We'll do it from a PSIR perspective itself. So write down election funding or campaign financing. Campaign financing. Campaign financing. Campaign financing. Okay. But from a PSI perspective. So which theory? Which theory would look into public funding or funding of elections? We've done multiple. We've done Marxism, we've done elite and pluralism and liberalism and feminism and the subcategories also. So which theory can we look at funding of elections through? What would the Marxists consider public financing? Or it's, sorry, campaign financing. Marx specifically did not, because we did not have a very strong concept of political parties at that time. So Marx specifically does not talk about it. What you would find is sometimes maybe Gramsci and others. But there is a Marxist view on campaign financing or funding of elections. So electoral bond was what? When we talk about the electoral bonds, they were funded by and large, the corporates only. Right? They were funded by and large by the corporates. So what would be the Marxist view on this, on corporate funding of elections? In the US, it is known as campaign financing. So both of those terms can be used. So in the US, it would be known as campaign financing. Not my exam. The point is they can ask this. And if you had not prepared, then you would have to then link it to theory by yourself. Otherwise, you would end up writing from a GS perspective. Indrajeet committee has said this, Dinesh Goswami committee has said this, but that becomes a GS answer. Actually, you're going far too into depth. Right now, neo-Marxist, neo-Marxist, argue that campaign finances is a form of rent seeking, is a form of rent seeking. is a form of rent seeking. Is a form of rent seeking. What is rent seeking? It's commonly used in economics also. And you sometimes hear it in the news and especially in newspapers. Hindu has a editors, especially within the Hindu, do use this word quite often, which is rent seeking. What does it mean? No, it's not like I'm paying rent for this building. That is, what is rent seeking in this? It's not, well, you're near to the argument. Kathman. So basic idea is you end up giving money for favor. So I'll give you money. I'll give both the political parties money. Whoever comes into power, you have to pass this policy, or you give me that oil field, or you give me that gas field, you give me that mine, you give me that airport, but I'll give you campaign financing. So it is a form of rent seeking, whereby the initial argument against electoral bond was what? Made by Kapil Sibal. So he was one of the lawyers within the Supreme Court that argued against electoral bonds itself. And he ends up saying that it is a form of rent seeking. In the sense, the corporates are giving money to the government, right? So the people have no idea who has given the money, but the corporates know, and Sangeeta party knows. If they're giving hundreds of crores, or in this case, thousands of crores, to a particular political party, why would they not want the political party to know? So what would happen is, I've purchased the electoral bond, I'll give it to the political party, because that is how it is done. It is not immediately put into the political party's bank account. You have to physically give them. So they know who has given you the money. And then you can have a backroom deal whereby the political party knows who has paid. The person who has gotten knows. And there might be some quid pro quo, which the people would not be aware. Okay, this person or this company or this corporate has given money. The people have no idea. So why have they gotten this? If you know that this corporate has given them 1,000 crores and then they get a project much later on, within months, there's always an argument that this is quid pro quo, that you have given this money so that you can have a 2,000 crore worth of contract, which came out. Once the list for the electoral bond was, it came out, people ended up saying, okay, this company gave this much money and few months later they got this project. People don't have an awareness of this. So that is why the Supreme Court upheld the right to know, rather than the right to privacy of the corporate. But this is a form of rent seeking. Meaning you've given the political party some money, you've given the government some money, and in return, you ask for something else. So I give you rent money, you give me this building. I give you some campaign financing, and you give me something else. The basic concept comes from that. Understood? Write down. Private players, private players, private players spend money on campaign financing, spend money on campaign financing, spend money on campaign financing to get a bigger to get a bigger slice of the pie, or the economic pie, to get a bigger slice of the economic pie, in the form of subsidies, in the form of subsidies, in the form of subsidies, tax cuts, form of subsidies, tax cuts, reduction in regulations, and other favors, from the elected officials, and other favors from the elected officials, from the other elected officials. The neo-Marxists argue that this rent-seeking behavior through campaign finances, the neo-Marxists argue that this rent-seeking behavior through campaign financing does not enlarge the pie itself, does not enlarge the pie or the economic pie itself, does not enlarge the economic pie itself in favor of public welfare, in favor of public welfare, in favor of public welfare, favor of public welfare, favor of public welfare. Meaning, you have given the money to the elected officials, to the political parties, not so that your area can have better roads, so that the poor in your area can have better welfare policies. You have given the money for one simple reason, that you increase your wealth. So if this is the pie, this is not about enlarging the pie where it is shared much more. You have given, so if this is the share as a corporate that you have given money so that it increases to this. Only you get this. It is not meant for the people. And how is rent sought in all of this? You make sure that the regulations are removed. This happens with land property quite often, whereby a large number of builders, especially in states, they give money to state political parties. Why? So that, all right, this land is currently agricultural land. Then you change it to commercial land, or you change it to residential land. So the property value goes up immediately. But this is my property. So immediately I would earn a lot more money. And this is very common in states, whereby you want, or you give the government or the state government campaign financing. So once they come into power, you make sure that, oh, you have some agricultural land here, let's have a highway pass through it, so that the property nearby would increase. And later on, this property can be changed from agriculture to commercial or residential. And then you learn a lot of money from this, because you have purchased that agricultural property at a very low cost initially. And just changes through certain policies, you make a landfall in property prices. This is very common in India. The other is environmental regulations. That you reduce the amount of environmental regulations. You get a particular area, you don't have it declared as a forest area. It may be a forest area, not anymore. It allows you to undertake commercial activity, like cutting of trees for commercial reasoning. So all of these are forms of rent seeking, whereby the corporates do this to earn more profit or get more profit, rather than in the sense of public welfare. So that is why the Marxists criticize campaign financing, especially one that is hidden. And that became the issue with electoral bonds. All of this money that was flowing to political parties through corporates, was it for the welfare of the people? Are they giving money? Oh, please make sure that this area has a lot better primary healthcare centers. Was that the demand they were trying to win? No. It had to be on getting better slice of the pie itself. So you give 500 crores, so you earn 1,000 crores. Conceptually, is it clear? All right, write down. Indian Marxist, Indian Marxist, Indian Marxist. So specifically, it's been said by Sitaram Yechury, who's the head of the Communist CPI Marxist. But you can just say Indian Marxist also, is not a problem. So specifically was said by Sitaram Yechury. Indian Marxist consider corporate funding of political parties, consider political funding of political parties constituting the supply side of corruption, constituting the supply side of corruption, constituting the supply side of corruption, which is corroding Indian governance, which is corroding Indian governance, Indian governance. It's corroding Indian governance, Indian governance. So this is what the Marxists would argue. It had to be with rent seeking. And the second thing is The Indian Marxists have said supply side of corruption, meaning it leads to greater corruption. What is corruption in this? Rent seeking. The rent seeking behavior in itself, the changes in the policies that you make, it is an aspect of corruption. You may have the complete right to do it, but doesn't mean that you should, because those policies are not being done in favor of the people. It is being done in favor of the corporates. Conceptually, is it clear? So that becomes PSIR. So it's in GS, then only say rent seeking. Like, don't say Marxists have said it, just say rent seeking, that it encourages rent seeking behavior. Or the electoral bond scheme hid rent seeking behavior. And therefore, the Supreme Court upheld the right to know over right to privacy of the corporates. Right? Article 19, Clause 1, Clause A over Article 21. Any doubts on this? Right on the, which other theory? You get some rough idea? Which other theory? What would the pluralists say about this? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's a good thing. Why? So power is much more, there's more polarity to powers. So they would see it as a good thing. That it's not just elected officials that have power, but the power is being shared among different poles. What about the elitist? It can lead to, so that goes into Michael's iron law of oligarchy. Write down. C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills. So he's in relation to elitist theory. C. Wright Mill in the power elite, in the power elite, in the power elite, in the power elite, argues that a small group of economic elites, small group of economic elites, small group of economic elites, and powerful interest groups, dominate decision making, dominate decision making. Campaign financing is a means to this end. Campaign financing is a means to this end. Is a means to this end. It is utilized by elites. It is utilized by elites. It is utilized by elites to maintain control. Utilized by elites to maintain control over the political system. Elites to maintain control over the political system. Over the political system. Over the political system. So this he actually talks about in relation to the US itself, whereby in the US you spend billions of dollars in election campaigning. You have two main political parties, the Democratic, the Republicans. And it is said Hillary Clinton herself spent $1 billion just on her election campaign. Normal people don't have this money. So it is being completely done by corporates, the pharmaceutical companies, billionaires, and they have their own interest. And what is their interest? To maintain control. So that power is always in the hands of the elites. So whenever you find people who are challenging this power, not Donald Trump, right? He was not a challenger, he was part of this. So you had somebody at that time, Bernie Sanders. So when Hillary Clinton was trying to win the election, he was also there. And what he started was small campaign funding, meaning it was people financing. Like you give me $1, somebody gives me $10, somebody gives me, and he built a small amount, which was enough to basically compete with Hillary Clinton during those elections. This is something that takes the power away from the elites. Campaign financing allows them to have control. It allows them to have control over the people. I'm giving you $1 billion, I'm giving you $1 million. So I have control over you. Who you appoint, what you do in certain policies, I can ensure some form of rent seeking. But let's say you have state funding of elections. The government funds you. You cannot take any private money. The government would give you money. And on that basis, you win or start to win elections or compete for elections. Is that then a good thing or a bad thing in terms of elitist theory? State funding of elections. Bad for who? The elites. And this is what is seen in India also and the US. In the US, you do have a concept of state funding of elections. What their law says is if there is a presidential candidate who wants to take state funding of elections, he cannot take private money. But the amount of money that is given in state funding is few millions of dollars. And the American elections cost about $1 billion. So none of the presidents in the past, at least for I think now 30, 40 years, have ever gone for state funding. Because that would mean that this elite control would go away. And the elites don't want this. So one way that you can do this is maybe the House of Representatives and the US Congress passes a law whereby they increase the amount of money to, let's say, $500 million, which is easy to do. You can have state funding to that extent also. But it would not be done because then the power would be taken away from the elites themselves. It is in favor of the economic elites that state funding of elections does not happen. It is in their favor that private campaign funding still exists so that they can keep a control over the political system. Any thoughts on this? In India, the opposite case is made. It's not that what would happen in India, the political parties would take the state money and then they would take private money. Because the implementation of the law is weak. In the US, if somebody takes private money, the implementation of the law is stronger. That they can be stopped from doing it. And their candidature cancelled. In India, that is very difficult to implement. And that is also an issue within India. Even if you have state funding here, they'll take money from others also. So they'll take money from the government and then they'll take money from the corporates. How do you stop them from doing this? Because we don't have a very strong implementation. Conceptually, is it clear? Write down one more line. Elite theory or elite theorist consider that state funding of elections, consider the state funding of elections would reduce the control of the power elites, would reduce the control of the power elites on the political system. Power elites on the political system. On the political system. On the political system. On the political system. Therefore, it is opposed by the power elites. Therefore, it is opposed by the power elites. It is opposed by the power elites. That is actually one of the arguments made by Donald Trump. When he put up his candidature, his initial debates went viral, extremely viral. And he said that I would not be beholden to these corporate interests. Why? Because I'm a billionaire myself. I can use my own money. He did not use any of his money, but that's a different case altogether. He said, I'm not going to take corporate funding. I won't be beholden to others. Why? Because I have a lot of money myself. And then he also made the argument that everyone that was sitting on the stage, and later on Hillary Clinton, he funded them. And he ended up saying, you're corrupt because you made policies on my behalf in a form of rent-seeking. Because I know your friends who are also billionaires, and I also gave you money. And I know you indulged in this form of rent-seeking. Not the exact words, I'm paraphrasing from PSIR perspective, but that is the argument that he ended up making, and he won that election also. It's a different case how he did it, but that is the argument that was made by him. Conceptually, is it clear? Any doubts? All right. Slide down. Separate paragraph. Robert Dahl, R-O-B-E-R-T. Robert Dahl, R-O-B-E-R-T. Dahl, D-A-H-L. D-A-H-L. In Who Governs. In Who Governs. In Who Governs. Who governs? Question mark after that. Who governs? Question mark after that. Argues that elite members do not control the government. Argues that elite members do not control the government. He and other pluralist theorists. He and other pluralist theorists. He and other pluralist theorists argue that political power should be distributed. Political power should be distributed throughout society. Should be distributed throughout society. Throughout society. So, society. The corporates and the power elites, the corporates and the power elites are a dominant interest group, are a dominant interest group, are a dominant interest group that can influence through campaign financing, that can influence campaign through campaign financing, through campaign finances. However, such electoral payoffs is undertaken by other interest groups, is undertaken by other interest groups, is undertaken by other interest groups, other interest groups. It therefore allows plurality of power distribution. Therefore allows plurality of power distribution. Plurality of power distribution. Plurality of power distribution. So what he ends up arguing, and others, fine, you have the corporates and the billionaires that are a very strong, influential interest group. And through campaign financing, they can basically influence the elected officials. But so are others, no? When we did pluralist theory, we talked about the fact that rich farmers are also a strong interest group. They can also influence. Caste groups, religious groups, they're also strong interest groups. They can also influence. They can influence by the sheer number that they are there. That because it's in a democratic society, see, pluralism, we've talked about this, can only exist in a democracy. It cannot exist in a dictatorship. Why? Because A dictator would not want other plurality of power because Kim Jong-un, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi would completely want power with themselves. It's only in a democracy that you can actually have pluralist distribution of power. So even in that sense, if the billionaires or the corporates form an interest group, but so have the rich farmers, so have caste groups, religious groups, and others. And therefore, there is nothing wrong with this, according to them. It just means that the power is more distributed among others. Every elected official has electoral payoffs. Electoral payoffs, you give me something, I give you something in return. So if you're poor, but you're large in number, you give me votes, and I'll give you something in return, like roads or whatever that you require, or reservation. If you're rich, but you're less in numbers, so there are not many billionaires, right? There are not many corporates, but they also want to influence. So you give me money, and I'll give you something. So every elected official, with every active participant of democracy, indulges in an electoral payoff. If we as students or teachers, we can form an interest group that there should be more permanent teachers in government jobs. You as students can ask for lesser fees. So every interest groups. So it's an electoral payoff. You give them votes, they give you something in return. And here they have money, they're giving money, and they're getting something in return. So there's nothing wrong, according to the pluralist, in any of this. Conceptually, is it clear? The only mistake that would come in is if it is hidden. If it is hidden, that you're not actually aware of what the electoral payoffs are. The second problem that emerges with the pluralist theory is what Michael said, iron law of oligarchy. What if they become the only interest group and everyone is pushed out? Then it would become a sense of oligarchy. Any doubts? Write down. The pluralists argue that campaign financing should not transform the corporates as the sole interest group, as the sole interest groups, as the sole interest group to the exclusion of others, as the sole interest group to the exclusion of others, sole interest group to the exclusion of others that influence public policy, that influence public policy, that influence public policy, that influence public policy. It should not turn into the law of oligarchy. Turn into the law of oligarchy. Turn into the law of oligarchy. So that the corporates themselves do not become the only interest group. There should be pluralistic distribution of power. Because if they are the only one, so they and elected officials can become oligarchy. Then you're moving towards Michael's iron law of oligarchy. Any doubts on this? Conceptually, is it clear? All right. Write down the last theory. We can study from 5, 6 different perspectives, but you really won't have the space to write in the UPSC exam itself. Write down public choice theory. Public choice theory. Public choice theory. So it comes from economics, actually. Public choice theory. Applies economic principles. Applies economic principles. Economic principles to political processes, to political processes, to political processes, in which campaign financing, in which campaign financing, in which campaign financing is part of the marketplace, is part of the marketplace, is part of the marketplace for political influence, part of the marketplace for political influence, where donors provide funding, where donors provide funding for favorable policies, funding for favorable policies, for favorable policies, for favorable policies, favorable policies. So public choice theory really turns it economics. They consider everything to be a rational actor in this sense, and everything is just a sense of exchange. So if the donors are giving, if the donors are giving money, why? Because the elected officials want it, and in return, they would want some form of favorable policies. Goes back into the core concept of rent seeking. But how are journalists then different? Journalists then different. Journalists give you a favorable interview. They write a favorable editorial. Why? So that they can get access to you. And maybe later on, they can get favorable policies. So if I'm an elected official, I give a journalist an interview, what would happen? His TRP would go up. His position in his own field would go up. And what do I get in return? Easy interview. Favorable editorials. Marketplace, right? It's a give and take. And if the corporates are indulging in this, so are others. So are journalists. So are people also. As student groups, as teacher groups, as caste groups. Everyone is trying to engage with the elected officials to have some form of rent seeking. That I'll vote for you as a group if you give me this. So as a Lingayat or as a Jat community or as a Patidar community, we would vote for you if you give us OBC status. Marketplace, basic public choice theory. What it does is that it considers people as actors, meaning they know why they have voted because they do want something. It's not something to be avoided, the idea of rent seeking. It is something that I desire. I'm going to give you a vote if you give me something back in return. And therefore, then there is nothing wrong with this. So even when corporates give money, it's not an immoral behavior. It is, I wouldn't say it's moral behavior, neither would the public choice theory theorists. They just say how the market functions, right? There's nothing moral or amoral about this. This is how the market functions. So journalists can buy influence, corporates can buy influence, individuals can buy influence, voters can buy influence, interest groups can buy influence, pressure groups can buy influence. And that is how the marketplace functions. Conceptually, is it clear? Any doubts? All right, but write down the problem in the same paragraph. Elected officials are expected to pursue public interest, to pursue public interest, to pursue public interest and not special interest, and not special interest, and not special interest, special interest, special interest. So the public choice theorists also talk about this. The idea is, why have people elected you? For public welfare, right? But if you're then taking special welfare, meaning you end up supporting the corporates, you end up supporting few individuals, few groups over others, then you're not thinking about public welfare. You're thinking about special welfare. But is that wrong? According to then public public choice theorists, is it wrong? Hmm? See, again, they don't make moral or immoral ideas. What would happen in that situation? So if the elected official pursues special interest rather than public interest, then the public would remove them. So again, it's a give and take. Meaning, if you don't give to the market what the market desires, so the public are demanding public welfare, and if you don't give it to the public, what would the public do? They would not vote for you. So they have broken everything down then to a economic marketplace. But it is a huge problem in this situation because this really doesn't work with concept of democracy. Here, what would happen is for 5 years, then I've given everything away. And then it doesn't matter. No? After 5 years, I'll come back with for elections. And I would do enough with in terms of corporate and with few special interest groups to win the election. So breaking down everything just to uh, as an economic marketplace would not work in political science. Doesn't work in understanding political science. But you get the concept. So for them, even if you undertake special interest, the public would then throw you out. Why? Because you have not undertaken public welfare. And then it comes back to the last point, which is John Rawls. Write down. John Rawls. John Rawls. What would he say about public financing and criticize the public choice theory? Injustice. What would he say on this? While it's a difference principle. But that's very to the core of the theory. What would he say in relation to public campaign financing per se? The point of the matter, as far as the public choice theory is concerned, if you only pursue special interests, it breaks down the social contract. Right? Because that is in the veil of ignorance, when you're in the original position, you had not decided for special interest, right? You had decided for public interest. So if you do have a government or the social contract moves towards the idea of special interest being pursued, then it's a breakdown of the social contract itself. But that is not the core of the question. The question is financing. See, John Rawls was there when this issue was emerging within the United States, the issue of campaign financing. So he has talked about this. So this idea that the social contract breaks down, you find it in his writings itself. But what would he say about campaign finance? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Good thing or bad thing? Bad. Right on. He considers, John Rawls considers that public funding or public financing of elections, public funding or public financing of elections will establish an equalizing influence, will establish an equalizing influence. Equalizing influence. It would ensure that powerful elites, it would ensure that powerful elites do not exercise, powerful elites do not exercise undue influence in the electoral process, undue influence in the electoral process, undue influence in the electoral process. It creates a level playing field, with ex ante equality. Level playing field with ex ante equality. Ex ante equality. So he talks about the funding of elections, not directly in terms of the corporate financing, but public financing. Meaning you need public financing of elections so that the corporates do not have undue influence. So within that sense, when he talks about the corporate campaign financing, it's not a good thing, because it means that special interest groups are getting much better or more influence, and it would lead to the breakdown of the social contract. Conceptually, is it clear? But don't write it would lead to the breakdown of the social contract, because that seems very, how do I say this? It seems very alarming to write in that manner in UPSC. That the complete system would go down and it would become Arajakta, and don't remain optimistic in the UPSC answer. Conceptually, is it clear? So Rawls ends up supporting public financing of elections. Why? It produces ex ante equality, meaning that the candidates that are now trying to win elections, everyone starts from the same field, right? So if somebody has less money, the difference principle. Somebody has more money, fine. But if somebody has less money, public financing can be there. So public financing of election, therefore, then does fall under the difference principle. It ensures that this idea of campaign financing by the corporates does not destroy the social contract by producing special interest, or by promoting or the domination of special interest. Any doubts on this? No doubts? Or, so these are all the policies you can, or arguments you can write. My suggestion would be write the Marxist one, write the pluralist one, and write the elitist one. These three, if you have then space left, then talk about Rawls, and then the last one would be public choice theory. Because that one comes from economics. It does not actually come from PSIR. And see, we can also talk about what Noam Chomsky has said about public financing, campaign financing, but it's way too much information for UPSC in itself. Any doubts? No doubts? All right. So the theoretical part of election funding that you understand, just write down one separate subheading. State funding of elections. 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 So what I'll do is make you write from a GS perspective, but the theoretical concept here would be of Rawls. Because here the only theory that you can then write is in relation to Rawls itself. Because others have not directly talked about public financing. What they have talked about is corporate financing of elections. But Rawls specifically talks about public financing of elections. So in terms of state funding of elections, then you can bring in theoretical concept of Rawls itself. Write down. The Indrajeet Gupta Committee on Election Funding, the Indrajeet Gupta Committee on Election Funding recommended. The Indrajeet Gupta Committee on Election funding recommended the creation of an election fund, the creation of an election fund, creation of an election fund with contribution from the center, contribution from the center and all states, from the center and all states, from the center and all states. State funding will be provided, state funding will be provided to parties recognized as national and state parties, to parties recognized as national and state parties by the Election Commission of India, and state parties by the Election Commission of India, by the Election Commission of India. Any state funding will be in kind and not cash. 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 Any elections, state funding will be in kind and not cash. The political parties would have to submit, the political parties would have to submit their annual accounts to the income tax authorities, annual accounts to the income tax authorities, Right. So this is something that has been said by the Indrajeet committee. It is one committee that has gone out and recommended for state funding of elections in India. It basically ends up saying, so the Indrajeet committee ends up saying that you have state funding of elections. You would have the center plus all states. They basically gave the figure that the center provides 600 crores and all the states combined provide 600 crores. Overall, 1,200 crores, which would be then given to national and state political parties in India, to each of the candidates that have been set up by the national and state political parties. Only those that are recognized by the Election Commission. Every year, they have to submit an annual report to the income tax authorities. Further, there has to be scrutiny by the Election Commission. So it is one committee that actually recommended state funding. One of the reasons why it was not done, there are multiple reasons. One of the reasons in the committee itself is the financial condition of India at that time did not allow for state funding of elections itself. And secondly, there are multiple reasons. If I'm a national party, I know I can only win 50 seats, but I'll get funding for 545. So I'll put up 545 candidates because I know I'll get much more money because of that. Same thing would happen in states also. And there would then be massive misuse of money. And the main thing that has been said is that the political parties would take the money and then they would also take private money. In India, you have to stop the ability of the private or the political parties to not take private money, which is the same in the United States. Unless that happens, the state funding of elections in India becomes extremely, it's not just problematic, it becomes completely unfair also, especially to the ones that are not recognized as parties. It reduces the concept of substantive democracy in India. Meaning, if you're not recognized as a political party, multiple, like Aam Aadmi Party when it started was not recognized. But they would be badly hit by this because they would not get state funding also. And then they can not take private money also. So how would they start and win elections? Conceptually, is it clear? And initially, if it had been introduced when India got its independence, would you have so many political parties right now in India? No. Would still have the domination of the Congress or maybe one or two more parties. It would have been very difficult for others to emerge during this time. Write down. The AP Shah Committee Report on Electoral Reforms. The AP Shah Committee Report on Electoral Reforms. AP Shah Committee Report on Electoral Reforms does not consider, does not consider, does not consider that complete state funding of elections, the complete state funding of elections, complete state funding of elections is feasible in India, is feasible in India, is feasible in India, is feasible in India. Why is it not feasible? We don't actually have the money for this. We don't have the money that is required to be spent in terms of election funding. The state cannot provide this. Right on the next one. The Dinesh Goswami Committee Report on Electoral Reforms. The Dinesh Goswami Committee Report on Electoral Reforms 1990. The Dinesh Goswami Committee Report on Electoral Reforms 1990 does not favor state funding of elections, does not favor state funding of elections, state funding of elections because of the practical difficulties, because of the practical difficulties in its implementation, because of the practical difficulties in its implementation, practical difficulties in its implementation, in its implementation, in its implementation. Which you understand, right? If we talk about what are the problems that would emerge with state funding, you can come up with multiple reasons. 1990. What did you write? 1990. Right on. The second ARC report, the second ARC report, the second ARC report recommended partial state funding of elections, partial state funding of elections, partial state funding of elections for reducing illegitimate, for reducing illegitimate election expenses, illegitimate election expenses, illegitimate election expenses. So it's second ARC anyways very significant for governance. So I think it's in the chapter Ethics in Governance. It was after the second ARC report that was added into the UPSC syllabus also. Ethics in Governance. And they say that there should be partial funding of elections, meaning some amount the parties would raise by themselves and some amount would be given by the government. But it raises again the same problem. They would take both the money and they would also take illegitimate money, the black money and other things. What you have said is to remove illegitimate money in election financing. What is illegitimate money? Black money. Money that has gone through corruption, money that has come from illegitimate means like drug trafficking and other things. Would it reduce? No. The problem in all of these recommendations are what you're trying to do is remove the concept of black money, illegitimate funding, corporate influence from elections through public financing. What you're trying to do is not target the problem itself directly. If you want to reduce black money, make your police work better. Right? Make sure that your police works a lot better so that these money that is being raised from black money, illegal, illegitimate means like drug trafficking and other things, you remove and reduce that, all of this would not be a problem. In Punjab, if you want to make sure that black money doesn't, or election funding doesn't come from drug smuggling, you stop drug smuggling. You do not give them money out of the state coffers or taxpayer money so that they'll use the illegitimate money plus they'll use the state funding. You're not targeting the problem directly in this situation. The same is the problem with other things. If you want to reduce corporate influence, make sure that the politicians are better. Make sure that the politicians are better at the end of the day, or you go for the pluralist theory that the power is a lot more distributed in those situations. You have better deliberative democracy so that corporate influence does not lead to Michael's law of oligarchy. One of the best ways to ensure that it doesn't lead is deliberative democracy. So what you're doing is by introducing this concept of state funding to reduce all of these problems, you're not targeting them directly. The foundation of the problem lies somewhere else, and you should target the foundation and not the consequences of those problems. Illegitimate funding is a consequence of drug smuggling. You reduce drug smuggling, illegitimate funding in itself would go away in Punjab. Conceptually, is it clear? Any doubts? Write down the next point. NCRWC, the National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution, NCRWC, has recommended, or actually, NCRWC does not endorse state funding of elections. Does not endorse state funding of elections. State funding of elections. But if it is implemented, greater regulation of political parties are required. If it is implemented, greater regulation of political parties is required. Political parties is required. Political parties is required. Political parties is required. So again, most of the committees do not recommend. There's only one, Indrajeet committee, which recommends state funding. Everything else, one of them have said partial state funding. Every other committee has basically said no state funding. They've given their reasons, which I made you write. This would become your GS answer. In PSR, add what Rawls has said. That would then improve your answer. You can also then bring in pluralist theories and others. But they really don't talk about state funding of elections. What they talk about is campaign financing, especially in relation to corporate. So those are two different aspects. Any doubts? All right. Just write down a comparative perspective then. Comparative perspective. Comparative perspective. Again, both of them can be used in GS and in PSIR. So write down, in India, no state funding is provided for elections. No state funding is provided for elections. In India, no state funding is provided for elections. But in-kind funding is provided. In-kind funding is provided, such as time allotted on state TV, free provisions of electoral rolls, among others. So in India, what happens? No cash is given, but India still provides some in-kind funding. In-kind is basically if you're running for elections and if you're a recognized state or national political party, you would be able to run some ads or go on national TV in relation to your campaign. The time would be provided by DD or All India Radio. If you make the request for it, it has to be provided. the electoral roll that is there. So if you're a candidate, you'd get free of cost from the Election Commission of India. So the complete electoral roll for that particular district, you'll get from the Election Commission of India. So all of this is provided in kind. Even when the Indrajeet committee talks about state funding, he also says not in cash, but in kind. So one of the things he says is to provide free diesel, meaning you need a lot of campaigns or a lot of car movement and other things are there. So whatever the cost of petrol and diesel is, that is provided to you. But again, the same thing would happen. No? They'll take that money also and they'll take the personal money and the corporate money. So in India, even if state funding is provided, it would be in kind. The 1,200 crores they talk about, it is not cash money that is given. It is in kind money that is provided. Right on. In the US, in the US, in the US, matching funds are provided. Matching funds are provided. Matching funds are provided. In the US, matching funds are provided, or state funding, or state funding, or state funding for presidential elections, for presidential elections, for presidential elections. Only if private contribution, only if private contribution is refused. Only if private contribution is refused. Private contribution is refused. Is refused. So this was actually the US policy. We'll only talk about the presidential elections, not the state relation to the governor. The basic idea is, if you're a president that is standing for elections, what you can do is ask for state funding and money would be provided, not in kind, actual hard cash would be provided to you, but you cannot take any private contribution. That cannot be there. If you're caught taking private contribution, your candidature would completely go away or it would be rejected. So I think for the past 34, I don't even remember which last US president actually went for public funding. The point is, it's an individual choice. Just because I have taken doesn't mean that the other one would also. So Donald Trump ended up saying, let's have state fund. I'll take public funding if Hillary Clinton agrees to it. But Hillary Clinton herself said no. Why? Because she raised more money than Donald Trump. She actually raised a lot more money as compared to Donald Trump, even though he himself has a lot of money. You cannot, the amount of money that the US state funding is, you cannot win elections. It's just not there. And this is the main problem, what Noam Chomsky also talks about. He highlights this as a problem, not as a theory. He ends up saying that one of the reasons why this limit is not being increased is because the power elites do not want it to be increased. If the limit is now $500 million, then likelihood that the presidents would choose for state funding. So the corporate influence would completely go away because they would not now require corporate financing of elections. So one of the reasons that law is not being passed, that bill is not being introduced. Why? Because it serves the corporate interest. Any thoughts? All right. Right on. In the UK and Canada, in the UK and Canada, in the UK and Canada, both direct state funding, in the UK and Canada, both direct state funding and indirect subsidies are provided. Both direct state funding and indirect subsidies are provided. Indirect subsidies are provided. Indirect subsidies are provided. However, in countries such as Italy, Israel, Finland, in countries such as Italy, Israel, and Finland, which have embraced public funding, Italy, Israel, and Finland, which have embraced public funding, have not witnessed any visible reduction, in election expenditure. any visible reduction in election expenditure. Only a small reduction was seen. Only a small reduction was seen within Germany and Japan. Only a small reduction was seen in Germany and Japan. In Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan. So comparative perspective, you can use it from comparative politics perspective also. And you can write it both in GS and PSIR. The point is the countries that have also implemented state funding, Finland, Israel, Japan, Germany, most of the countries have actually not seen any reduction in election expenditure. Japan and Germany have seen, but it's very insignificant in terms of the reduction. So what it shows is that the money from public funding is also being used, but also private funding. So there is no actual reduction, therefore, in election expenditure. It's only increasing in other countries, but in Germany and Japan, the figure is not significant. And in Japan, the other problem is it's basically has one political party. So there it doesn't even make sense to have this. Any doubts? One of the problems that emerged in Germany, there's a party known as AfD. It's basically a far-right party. It's known as the neo-Nazi party. They have certain ideas that are common to Nazi Germany. They use state funding to win seats. And secondly, that money can be siphoned off. You have SIMI that was banned in India. You have CPI Maoist that was banned in India. But both of them at one point in time also had political parties registered. So you provide them with state funding, even though they were not recognized. Presumption is you would still be providing them in kind, state subsidies or state funding, which therefore would lead to misuse in such situations. Any doubts on this? No. All right, so that is all in relation to public funding. You can write both from PSIR and GS perspective. In GS, when we talk about public financing, there are certain sections of representation of People's Act 1951 that also comes into the picture. But right now we're doing it only from a PSI perspective. So theory, that is for campaign financing. If it is asked on state funding, then you can also bring in relation to India, what the committees have said, bring in a little bit of comparative perspective, and then talk about what Rawls has said. Any doubts? No? One question, you had one question being asked on election funding, 2017 PSIR. So it's not been till date asked in GS. State funding may be an effective instrument in strengthening electoral democracy in India. Comment. How would you start the introduction? You write this answer and you show it to me tomorrow. Those online, they can, again, like the classes, you can send me on WhatsApp. Conceptually, is it clear? No doubts? Okay. All right, so we're done with election funding. Technically, because state funding has been asked, electoral bonds is in the news, which would be in relation to corporate financing of elections. So that we've talked about in relation to pluralist theory, the elitist theory, the Marxist theory, and others. That is much more likely, therefore, than to be asked in PSIR. And you can maybe have state funding or corporate funding be asked in GS itself. Any doubts? No. All right. So we'll move on to the next topic.